Love, love, love. Love, love, love. Love, love, love.
profMTH and those of you who have been following this debate will be aware that in my video God is Love I said this. Basically what the passage is doing, what Paul is doing, what the Apostle Paul is doing, is he's defining how love works itself out in practice in the specific situation that the Corinthian church is in, as we find in the immediate context of the passage. Now, while I would still argue that context is important when interpreting the Bible, I would not want to go as far as to say that Paul is defining how agape love works out only and exclusively in the specific situation that the Corinthian church is in. I understand, as profMTH has pointed out, that with such a limited interpretation one might logically conclude that there are other occasions in which love is impatient, unkind, boastful and rude, and so on and so forth. Obviously that is dangerous territory. So is 1 Corinthians 13 a definition of agape love? And if it is, has profMTH been right all along, that God's love is incompatible with his jealousy? Well, let's deal with those questions in turn. Is 1 Corinthians 13 a definition of agape love? Short answer, yes. Longer answer, yes, but an appreciation of the literary context it comes packaged in helps. You see, it is important to understand that 1 Corinthians is in fact a letter addressed to the Church of God in Corinth. And as such, Paul is saying here that this love ought to be characteristic of their Christian community. The believers ought to be patient with one another, kind towards each other, not envious of each other, and so on and so forth. And when you understand that Paul's inspiration for defining agape love in these terms probably comes directly from Jesus' own command and example, it is clear that this most excellent way, the way of agape love, is for all Christians everywhere. It was Jesus himself who first instructed his followers to love one another, and in doing so he gave the example of his own life as the pattern that they should follow. And John, who records for us this injunction, you'll find it in John 13:34. John, in translating Jesus' words, presumably from Aramaic, chooses out of all the Greek words for love to choose the word agape. In other words, Jesus' own life was characterized by agape love, and he commanded his disciples to relate to each other in exactly the same way, to mirror him in the way they behaved toward one another. So when Paul defines agape love for us in 1 Corinthians 13, undoubtedly he has the example of Christ in mind. Okay, obviously I have come full circle here, but does this mean that profMTH has been correct, right, all along? No. And this is where context is so important, because in context 1 Corinthians 13 is addressed primarily not to a married couple where one partner has been unfaithful, but to a dysfunctional community of believers where agape love is all but absent. Now, the distinction is important because the Bible legitimizes jealousy within marriage in the context of adultery, 2 Corinthians 11 verses 2 to 4. And it also speaks of God's relationship to his people as analogous to marriage. Just need to look at Ezekiel 16 verses 9 to 19 and verse 32. This is not to say, however, that agape love, as described in 1 Corinthians 13, should not characterize marital relationships. If it did, I expect there would be a lot less adultery. The truth is, the jealousy referred to in 1 Corinthians 13 is an entirely different kettle of fish to the jealousy prompted by marital unfaithfulness. The Bible, even Paul himself, makes a distinction. Let's just take a moment to define in words these two types, these two kinds of jealousy. First, the jealousy in 1 Corinthians 13. It means bitterly resenting someone for having something you don't possess. In the context of 1 Corinthians 13, that thing was what they saw as the greater spiritual gifts. My thesaurus uses these alternative words and phrases to describe it: bitter, covetous, envious, green-eyed, green with envy, grudging, resentful, all the things that agape love is not. Second, the godly jealousy of 2 Corinthians 11 verses 2 to 4 and 1 Corinthians 10 verse 22. Now this goes to the idea of wanting for yourself something that is rightfully yours. You might use the phrase jealously guarding. In this case, my thesaurus uses words under its second use of the word jealousy, like careful, possessive, protective, vigilant, and watchful. Now, the problem with profMTH's argument is that it relies on a very narrow understanding of jealousy. Jealousy has always been bad, is bad, and will always be bad. And as such, he sees Paul as being inconsistent. In one of his comments to me, he notes this: Paul seems to want to have it both ways vis-a-vis jealousy, i.e. it is both inconsistent with agape and also godly. This certainly isn't the only time Paul's writings prove to be inconsistent. So, who is right, profMTH or Paul? Well, as with anything, we need to ask which understanding coheres with reality. Certainly my thesaurus recognizes two uses of the word jealousy, but I suspect too that if you ask the average bod in the street if a married person was justified in feeling jealous in the face of adultery, I think their response would be yes. Let's take for a moment another tack and ask the question: can God ever be guilty of envy? Is it possible for God to envy? Well, who is greater than God that he should envy them? What can someone else supply that God is lacking? You might argue, well, possibly argue in the context of Exodus 20 verses 3 to 5 that he is envious of the idols. What? Bits of dead wood? Gods that don't exist? Gods that are no gods at all? Come on, it's far better to understand God's jealousy here as wanting to guard for himself something that is rightfully his by virtue of his being the one true and only God, namely the devotion and faithfulness of the people who have made a covenant with him. You could understand it also as being protective and caring. He doesn't want us to demean our human dignity by worshipping something that is non-existent and beneath us. God doesn't sit enthroned in the heavens feeling all sick, bitter, twisted and resentful because of a lump of wood. The very idea is laughable. He doesn't even need our devotion. Do you think the God who existed from all eternity was somehow lacking in all eternity, and only since in this comparatively insignificant finite piece of time began that we call human history that he's somehow being completed? When the Bible uses a word like jealous, even within the godly definition, it is using finite words to describe the indescribably infinite. Words like jealousy and love are at best only metaphors. They can only give us a dim, less than half-lit image of what they refer to in the glorious nature of the infinite and eternal God. In human language, God is communicating himself through a very poor medium. What is amazing is that he even does it at all. God indeed must be love.
All you need